I've always hated mirrors. As a kid, I'd avoid looking into them too long, especially in dark rooms. I never understood why until I moved into my new apartment. It was cheap, on the second floor of a rundown building. The landlord was strange, frail and quiet, always avoiding eye contact. She didn't say much when I signed the lease, but she did say, "It's quiet, perfect for someone like you." I didn't think much of it. That first night, I noticed the mirrors in the apartment. There were three, one in the bathroom, one in the hallway, and one in the bedroom. I didn't think it was weird at the time, but after a few days, I started to see something strange. In the bathroom mirror, there was a figure standing behind me, tall, thin, with dark hair. His face wasn't clear at first, just a shadow, but his eyes, they were empty, hollow. I spun around. The bathroom was empty. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but then it kept happening. Every time I looked into the mirror, he was closer, always behind me, his grin twisted, stretched unnaturally wide. His eyes never blinked. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, but the worst part wasn't just seeing him. It was the whispering. Every time I saw him, I heard a voice, faint at first, then growing louder, more guttural. "Let me out." One night, desperate to sleep, I shut my eyes tight and pulled the covers over my head. Then I heard it, the scratching. It was coming from the bedroom mirror. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, sharper. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. I approached the mirror, and as I stared at the fogged-up glass, I saw something written. "Let me out," I panicked. I turned to run but froze when I saw him, standing right behind me, his face twisted in that same horrid grin. The moment I ran into the hallway, I saw him again, in the hallway mirror. This time his face was clearer, but not just his face. There was something worse. In his eyes, there was me. It was like I was standing there with him, like he was me. I didn't know what to do. I left the apartment, never looking back. But when I called my mother, she told me something that made my blood run cold. She said the apartment was cursed. The mirrors weren't just mirrors, they were portals. And once you saw him, once he saw you, you couldn't escape. I thought I had left him behind. But that night, as I looked into a window at a streetlight, I saw him there, behind me, reflected in the glass. And now when I look in any mirror, I don't see just his reflection. I see both of us. I never believed in the supernatural, but after what happened, I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever want to. When I moved into a cheap, rundown apartment in a quiet part of the city, everything felt off. The building was old, the halls smelled musty, but the rent was low and I didn't mind the isolation. There was one thing that unsettled me though, a locked wooden door at the end of the hall. It was just a plain, heavy door with no handle, just a thin crack where you could sometimes see light leaking out. The landlord swore it was just a storage closet, but something about it didn't sit right. One night I came home late and the door was slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it, I always did, but it was open now. Without thinking, I pushed it further. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture, a dusty rocking chair in the corner. But the thing that hit me like a punch to the gut was the painting on the far wall. A portrait of a woman in an old-fashioned gown. She looked exactly like me. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. I stared at the woman's eyes, dark, hollow, empty. Her face was my face, but twisted in a way that didn't belong. I stepped back, heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when I realized I hadn't seen her face before, but I felt like I had. I bolted out of the room and slammed the door shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day I went to the landlord, and when I mentioned the room, he turned pale. "That door's been sealed for years," he said, voice trembling. "That room was never supposed to be open." I didn't believe him, but that night when I walked past the door, I felt a strange pull. I didn't want to, but I opened it again. The room was the same, but the painting was different now. It was me, dressed in the same gown, but the woman's eyes were cold, like she wasn't human, like she was waiting for me. And that's when I heard the whisper, "You can never leave." I turned, but the door slammed shut behind me, locking me in. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My skin crawled. The room felt like it was shrinking, pressing in on me. The air grew thick. The walls seemed to pulse. The painting in front of me began to shift. The woman's face distorted, twisted, and suddenly, it wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a reflection. I looked down at myself. I wasn't wearing the same clothes I had on before. I was in the same gown as the woman in the portrait. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey me. My hands were shaking, and when I looked up again, the woman in the painting was smiling at me, her lips stretched unnaturally wide. "It's your turn now," she whispered, her voice in my ear. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, and then I saw it. The door on the other side of the room had opened. Behind it was a hallway I didn't recognize, dark and endless. The worst part, I knew it was the same hallway from outside the room, the one I'd passed 1,000 times, but now it wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. The door closed behind me. I tried to scream again, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating silence. And the worst part, the woman wasn't in the painting anymore. She was standing right behind me. I never thought living alone would feel lonely, but when I moved into my new apartment, the isolation was suffocating. It wasn't a bad place, small but cozy, in an old building with creaky floors and paper-thin walls. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice enough. There was only one thing that bothered me: the room across from mine. It was locked and the door was sealed shut with a heavy iron bolt. I asked the landlord about it, but he just shrugged. "It's just a storage room," he said, but he didn't look at me when he said it. He had a nervous edge to his voice, like there was something he wasn't telling me. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, I had my own space. But as the days went by, the feeling of being watched started to creep up on me. It was subtle at first, like when you think you hear someone call your name, but no one's there, or when you see a shadow flicker out of the corner of your eye. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak, it's normal. But one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps. At first, I thought it was just the neighbors, but the footsteps stopped right outside my room. I held my breath. My heart was racing. I was frozen in place, and then I heard a voice. "Let me in," it whispered. It sounded like a man, but it was faint, like it was coming from behind the walls. I jumped out of bed, my head spinning. There was no one in the hallway, no one around, just silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my bed, staring at the door, listening. I kept hearing those soft footsteps, the whisper, "Let me in." It was like a ticking clock, persistent, slowly driving me mad. The next morning, I went to the landlord again. I told him about the footsteps, about the voice. His face went pale, and he avoided my eyes. "You shouldn't have heard that," he said quietly. "It's not safe here. I should have told you before, but it's too late now." He wouldn't explain further, just told me I needed to leave, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I was trapped in this old building with no other options. That night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I knew I had to check that locked room. My curiosity was too strong, and I needed to know what was happening in my own apartment. I grabbed a screwdriver and forced the bolt off the door. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty room. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust covering the floor, old boxes scattered about. But there, in the corner, was something I didn't expect. A single bed, and sitting on the bed, staring at me, was a man. He was thin, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak. He just sat there, unmoving, staring at me with that eerie, unblinking gaze. I backed away, heart pounding, and tried to speak, but no words came out. He still didn't move. That's when I saw it, the photo on the nightstand. It was a photo of me, my face, my exact pose, except it was taken from an angle I'd never seen before. I reached out for it, trembling, and I felt something cold behind me. I turned around. The man was standing right behind me, his face inches from mine. His breath was icy, and when he opened his mouth, his voice was like nails on a chalkboard. "You can't leave," he whispered. "You're mine now." The room seemed to close in on me. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the walls, by the very air around me. I ran for the door, but when I turned the knob, it wouldn't open. I pounded on the walls, screamed for help, but nothing. I looked back at the man, and he was still there, just standing in the corner, staring at me, unblinking. I don't know how long I was trapped in that room. Time didn't seem to exist anymore. Eventually, the door opened. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and collapsed in the hallway. But when I woke up the next morning, I was in my apartment, my bed, my room. Everything was just as it had been before, except for one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. The man, the one from the room, was sitting in the corner of my bedroom, just like before, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I realized then what the landlord meant. There had never been a locked room. The room was always with me.